start off by discussing whether Operation Market Garden could have succeeded in any way, shape or form. Dr. Chris Parry, I mean, if you change certain things, if you change the location of the drop zone so they weren't having to traverse such a big distance in a relatively short space of time, would that have made much of a difference?
We mentioned earlier there's a lot of moving parts in this operation, and I'm afraid to say there are just too many moving parts where everybody depends on each other. The drop zones are too far away, there's no question about that. They can't actually get in. There's also Germans on the ground, and this is the critical issue. If you're dropping into a neutralised area, it's a totally different prospect. But the fact is you have two Panzer Corps there. You've got modal coordinating operations. You've got talented German generals. It's absolutely the wrong place to try this sort of operation. And the fact is that, as we mentioned earlier, they'd looked at 16 other types of operation where they could actually put airborne troops in. And they went, no, that's not going to work either. And for various reasons to do with competition between the commanders, between what I would call the Good Ideas in Action Club as well, we've gone for this. It looks attractive, there's no question about that, but when you actually look at the detail, all of it looks shaky, to tell you the truth.
Chris Copson, do you agree with that?
Well, Montgomery, to his dying day, maintained that if Market Garden had been properly supplied and resourced, it would have worked. I find that quite a difficult statement to support, but I think what might have just made a bit of a difference, if those drop zones could have been closer,
yeah,
and if the Paras had been able to get into the centre of Arnhem, if they'd had the right sort of kit, because the whole thing about fighting in built-up areas is it's a lot easier for the defender than it is for the attacker. They could perhaps have stuck it out if they'd had both sides of the bridge, if they were well dug in, if they got an ample supply of mortar rounds, of Piat rounds, it's possible they could have held out a bit longer.
I mean, the other critical thing, of course, is they don't have tactical air. There's a lot of transport dropping stuff into the German areas, but there's no tactical air helping here.
That's the problem, because they're convinced they'll get the two confused.
Correct.
And that you'll have problems with
air traffic coordination, prioritisation, blue on blue. But the fact of life is, if you've got tactical air here operating, then it's a totally different battle. As Chris says, fighting in built-up areas is not easy, but if you're neutralising any approaching armour or any approaching formations with air power, then you're able to do that. I mean, there is a range issue, there's no question about that, is where you're going to operate them from. But all the way along the route for 30 Corps, they had the availability, if they wanted it, of air power. But of course, the idea that we shouldn't confuse this was part of that. And I think that fundamentally is the problem here. If you're going to do a blitzkrieg type approach, you actually got to incorporate the air. There's no question about that.
But if you look at what was happening in Normandy, I mean, German tankers are petrified of Yabos, fighter bombers. But as Chris has just said, they're operating from airfields in England and still in Normandy. We haven't managed to move those much further forward. Their range is limited, but it might have made a big difference. If the moment a Panzer pulls out of cover, it gets clouted by a typhoon, you know, that might have done the trick.
But isn't Market Garden also, and this is one of its major flaws, it's predicated on the idea that the Germans are a spent force. And so, if Montgomery's planning it from that perspective, then yes, it may have worked. But of course, they discovered something very different in reality.
Matthew Ridgway, American general, he, before Market Garden, says, I believe that German command and control has disintegrated. That is the whole thing it's predicated on.
I think there's another issue as well. I think Eisenhower takes his eye off the ball here and says, this is Montgomery's baby. And, you know, he may succeed.
You own it.
He may fail. Yeah, you own this. And I think also we have to remember, Eisenhower had actually had an operation on his knee at this stage. He wasn't very mobile. And actually, you wonder whether he's actually looking at this in the same way he would in other ways. Meanwhile, everybody else, of course, is thinking, oh, Montgomery's messing up in the north. Oh, good.
So if you were Eisenhower then, and you haven't had that knee operation, we've never had knee operations thrown in as a what-if before, what would you have done? You'd have gone with Patton?
No, I think Eisenhower was being fairly battered by Montgomery. And as we said, there were all sorts of prestige issues associated with it. It looks attractive. And, Montgomery's constantly challenging Eisenhower and saying, why not? Why not? It looks good. They're not quite ready here in terms of logistics to do the broad front that Eisenhower wants. As Chris said earlier, Montgomery's had a good track record up to this point. And I'm afraid to say everybody's looking at their next job at this point, saying if I'm successful in one or two of these theatres, I've got a job after this.
That's the thing. Montgomery, with his record, with Alamein in the background, is seen as this consummate tactician and planner who takes everything into account. He's probably a safer pair of hands than Patton, blood and guts. And I think that may have swayed Eisenhower's mind.
But I think we've got to remember Eisenhower's only been in charge.
Yes.
Okay,
Since the start of September.
Weeks.
Yeah.
He's only been in charge for 2 weeks, so he's testing and thinking about his own sort of capabilities, but also those of his subordinate commanders. I mean, there comes a point where Montgomery is almost saying to Eisenhower, "I'm better than you at this," and Eisenhower says, "That's true, Monty, but remember, I'm your boss."
Well, let's explore a couple of big what-ifs then and look at some of the longer-term historical consequences. We'll come on to what might have happened had Market Garden never gone ahead in a moment. But first, let's just say Montgomery's plan works brilliantly and it does succeed. Chris Copson, what does that change? I mean, the idea is, it's been written up in history that if Market Garden succeeds, the war is over by Christmas. Is that true?
Probably not. But we could have gone a lot further. If Market Garden had succeeded, if 30 Corps had gone straight down that road onto the other side of the Neder Rhine, you're on to the North German plain, and the British Army's playground for decades in the past. We might also have, as Chris said to start with, German 15th Army actually penned up here if they don't get away. We could have driven through, certainly. I think the other thing is, assuming we get onto the North German plain, assuming we're actually into Germany itself, what's going to go through Hitler's mind? Is he going to start panicking, as we know he's quite capable of doing, overreacting, pulling units back from the east to counter this threat?
Chris, I think his real sensitivity is the Ruhr, to tell you the truth, the industrial base here. Yeah. And I think if you are Eisenhower, if you've got a breakthrough here, you know what the schedule is in terms of where the Russian sphere of influence is going to be, where the Allied influence is going to be. And I think you're going to see a right hook here.
Yes.
And I think there are two reasons for that. One is you've got quite a substantial build-up of armour from the east happening. You've got Manteuffel here, who's come from the east. We know from history that Hitler's setting up for the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes here. So Sepp Dietrich's Panzer Army is on the way as well. So what we probably would have seen is a hook round here to isolate the Ruhr, the industrial area. I think Hitler would have been really concerned about that because it's behind the Siegfried line. But what you've also got to do is make sure that if you do go across here, you're going to get flank attacked by two Panzer armies. Because if that happens and von Zangen here says, well, actually, I'm not going to get isolated, I'm going to fight my way out, you've got the whole British Second Army completely isolated and surrounded by three Panzer armies.
So do you think the Battle of the Bulge doesn't happen, or you get an equivalent battle but somewhere else?
Yeah, I think that's right. The Bulge actually goes north rather than west. Yeah. And in fact, it would be very interesting to know what would have happened if you'd have put a whole Allied army here that had been destroyed on the North German plain by not only 15th Army, but the two Panzer armies that are setting up for the Battle of the Bulge.
So ironically, maybe the Germans have a better chance of winning that.
Yeah, almost certainly, because they're on internal lines, their supply, and again, we must remember in the Battle of the Bulge, they had a timetable too to get to the Meuse. And so they don't have that timetable. They're defending the Ruhr. They're close to quite a lot of their armaments factories here and points of communication. And I think Eisenhower at that point would have said, you know what, we're going to have to do quite a lot here to rescue the Brits. So instead of having an Arnhem with a division side, you could have had a whole army trapped here.
Talking of the Battle of the Bulge, just to mention, of course, we did a full episode on the Battle of the Bulge a few weeks ago. Go and check that out. Chris Copson, just to bring you in on that, do you kind of agree that the Battle of the Bulge or something like it happens? And maybe, sort of counterintuitively, Market Garden succeeds in this scenario, but the Germans win the Battle of the Bulge or a variant of
I
it?
think that's entirely plausible. I mean, I mentioned the North German plain earlier, but I entirely agree with Chris. We would have hooked around into the Ruhr itself. If you take the Ruhr out, you've destroyed Germany's industrial capacity. That is something that Hitler is really not going to want to happen. So he is going to be diverting forces in to deal with that. It is quite possible that we may have had an entire army group trapped North German plain through to the Ruhr. It's then a question of how do the Americans ride to the British Army's rescue?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because what you've got, Arnhem in microcosm is what could have been happening here. You've got the Americans trying to come and rescue an army group level instead of a division.
Yeah.
And Chris Parry, you don't think it's realistic that even had Market Garden succeeded, that the war would be over by Christmas?
No, by no means. And it's not just the situation on the ground here, with quite a lot of fighting power left in the West to the Germans. There's also a logistics issue. Remember, we haven't got these ports up and running. If the Germans are still holding Rotterdam, we can't use that. So it's going to take a while to get Antwerp going. They've still got their aviation here. It's been pretty much decimated, but they've still got aviation here that can attack Antwerp. Yep. You've also got V1, V2 rockets. And one of the reasons for Market Garden was actually to get some of the launch sites here, the V2 rockets that are hitting Britain and indeed Western Europe. So you've got quite a lot of fighting power still here. What is interesting is that the point at which Hitler would have said, I've brought enough troops from the east, you've got to stand and fight where you are now. I think the people who really would have suffered here are the German population. This is a very heavily populated area, Western Germany, and if this had been fought over, I think some of the destruction and the death would have been significant.
And Chris Copson, what about if Operation Market Garden doesn't go ahead? Does that fundamentally change the timescale of the war?
I don't think equally with the fact that if Market Garden succeeds, it doesn't end the war much quicker, possibly a little bit quicker. I think if it hadn't, the same thing pertains. The other thing is, of course, is we're in September now. We've got winter coming in, and things are going to sort of the seasonality of Germany is going to clog up the works. I mean, if you leave the Battle of the Bulge out of it, which was fought in pretty desperate conditions by a very desperate enemy, it's still going to drag through into the following spring by the time that everything can actually start moving again. And, as Chris pointed out, we've got major logistic problems. It's all having to track by Red Bull Express, American truck convoys, for the most part, all the way across France to actually keep everybody going.
Could it have gone even worse for the Allies at Market Garden? And if so, what impact does that have?
Well, it's interesting the way that Arnhem was fought. We've hinted already that actually it was fought in a very gentlemanly way. Both sides were indicating, I think, there's probably near the end of the war now. What could have happened is we could have actually had serious massacre in Arnhem. If we'd lost a whole division, they hadn't surrendered, or the SS commanders had said, well, actually, you put yourself here and killed everybody, that would have had a significant effect on, I think, some of our operations and the way we were going to do things.
Equally, I think one of the reasons it didn't go worse there is the terrain. Is the fact that for both sides it was a major hindrance. You have got these narrow roads, plentiful waterways, some big rivers, worst tank country, well, except for perhaps the Ardennes, that's probably worse. But I mean, that kept the lid on a lot of it. So, yeah, I think that closes it down as well.
Dr. Chris Parry, I want to finish with a slightly outlandish thought, but go with me. We mentioned that Peter Carrington, who went on to be UK Foreign Secretary at the start of the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher, was at Operation Market Garden. He was at Nijmegen. I mean, had, for example, he been killed there, could the Falklands War have panned out differently? Bear with me, because he resigns in 1982, a few days after the Argentinians invade the Falklands, because he basically put his hand up and said, OK, I'll take the can for the Foreign Office being complacent. Could the Falklands have panned out differently, or am I being completely OTT?
No, I think the Foreign Office had the capacity to mess that up, whoever they had as Foreign Secretary, to tell you the truth.
I think I'd probably agree.
Yeah, I thought I'd just throw it out there. Thank you to you both. This has been genuinely absolutely fascinating. I think we can probably say that had Operation Market Garden succeeded, which is pretty unlikely, it may not have actually changed the fundamental outcome and timescale of the Second World War. By this point, the writing was already on the wall for Hitler. But would it have brought the war to an end earlier? Would it have all been done by Christmas? Probably not. In fact, there is an argument that if Operation Market Garden had succeeded, counterintuitively, it may have been worse for the Allies long term, because it may have meant that you had a version of the Battle of the Bulge more favourable to the Germans, that potentially they may have won. Some really interesting long-term consequences, all stemming from Operation Market Garden. But as we've been unpicking, in reality, probably it was doomed to fail from the start. My thanks today to Dr. Chris Parry and Chris Copson, and join us next time as we undo more battles from history. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone with James Hanson. Goodbye.